The town of Maple Hollow had always worn its seasons like a well-loved quilt stitched together by the reds and golds of autumn, the quiet hush of snow in winter, and the tender green of spring. For Sarah Thompson, the passing years had been measured less by the turning of leaves and more by the silent calendar of longing. Sarah had lived in Vermont all her life. Its winding roads, framed by sugar maples and the soft hills that rolled toward the horizon, had been the backdrop of her childhood, her courtship with David and their quiet life together in the white, clapboard house at the end of Willow Lane. To the world, theirs was an idyllic picture, a porch swing that creaked in the breeze, window boxes spilling with geraniums in summer, and the faint sound of David's piano lessons drifting into the street. But inside, the air often carried a heaviness that had no sound. For 6 years, Sarah had carried the weight of a hope that refused to die. She had measured time in doctor's appointments in small bottles of medication lined up like sentinels on the kitchen counter in monthly cycles that ended in disappointment. Each autumn she had thought maybe by next year, and each spring she had watched other women in town push strollers past her window. David, gentle and patient, had been her constant. He never pushed, never demanded, but Sarah could see the longing in his eyes when he held his sister's baby or when they passed the nursery aisle at the local department store. They didn't speak about it every day, longing that Raw couldn't survive the open air too often, but it was there like the faint outline of a mountain, always visible in the distance. Winter in Vermont had a way of slowing life to a whisper. Snow gathered in drifts against the fence. The river froze at its edges and evenings arrived long before dinner was ready. Sarah found comfort in that stillness in the way the whole world seemed to be holding its breath. She often thought of herself in those months as part of the landscape, waiting dormant, unseen. But beneath the snow seeds always slept, waiting for their time. On the first Sunday of January, Sarah woke before dawn. She lay in the quiet, listening to David's slow breathing beside her, and felt a strange pull and inexplicable urgency to see the sunrise. Pulling on her coat and boots, she stepped out into the brittle air. The world was blue and silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. As she reached the small hill behind their house, she stood watching the horizon bloom into pale gold. And without warning, she felt a wave of yearning so fierce it stole her breath. It was not new, this longing for a child, but in that moment it felt like a promise whispered by the sky itself. Their journey had been marked by clinical rooms that smelled faintly of antiseptic, by the cold slickness of ultrasound gel, by the distant clatter of hospital carts. Sarah had learned to read the expressions of specialists before they spoke to brace herself for the gentle but crushing phrases. "We'll try again," or "I'm sorry." In the 3rd year of trying, they had turned to in vitro fertilization. The process was relentless, early morning injections, hormone surges that left her dizzy, the sterile intimacy of procedures that were supposed to be about love. The first cycle failed. The second brought hope for 8 brief weeks before ending in miscarriage. The grief was a private kind, one that the world did not pause to acknowledge. David had been the one to keep them from collapsing under the weight of it. He brought her tea without asking, played soft music in the evenings, read aloud from the newspaper in a tone so ordinary it made her believe they could still have an ordinary life. As another winter settled over Maple Hollow, Sarah found herself both braced against and strangely comforted by its stillness. The town seemed to hold her in a kind of quiet companionship. At the bakery, Mrs. Callahan would slip an extra cinnamon roll into her bag without a word. At the library, the elderly librarian would save her the newest novels before they were placed on the shelves. People didn't ask questions, but their gestures spoke of a shared hope. One afternoon, a week before Christmas, Sarah stood at the window watching snow fall in the kind of perfect unhurried flakes that seemed designed for postcards. David was in the next room, the faint strains of a piano etude floating through the air. She imagined what it might be like to hear a baby's laughter mingling with that music. For the first time in months, the thought didn't ache quite so sharply. It felt possible. The turning point came in late February when the days were still short, but the snow had begun to soften at the edges. They had one last round of treatment scheduled, a final attempt before they would let the dream rest, or at least that was what they told each other. Neither of them truly believed they could ever let it go. Sarah approached the appointment with a cautious heart. She had learned not to let hope run too far ahead, but something in the way the sunlight poured through the clinic window that morning felt like an omen. The procedure was as clinical as all the others, yet she left with an odd lightness, as if the air itself had shifted. The waiting was always the hardest part. Days stretched like elastic, every twinge of her body a question every morning, an exercise in patience. She moved through her routines, making tea, tending to the small collection of potted herbs on the kitchen windowsill, walking through the frost-tipped streets with an awareness that life might be about to change. On the 12th day, she woke before David and sat at the edge of the bed, the pregnancy test clutched in her hands. She watched as the second line bloomed slowly into view, faint but undeniable. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Then she pressed the test to her chest and closed her eyes as if holding it there might make it more real. She didn't wake David right away. Instead, she padded into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and stood in the pale light of dawn, letting the enormity of it wash over her. 6 years of trying, of heartbreak, of carrying a hope that had sometimes felt more like a burden, and now here it was, fragile but alive. When she finally told David, the look on his face was something she would carry with her forever. Joy, disbelief, and a kind of quiet reverence, as if they had been handed something sacred. They didn't shout or weep. They simply held each other in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant creak of the house, the only sounds. Joy. The weeks that followed were filled with a careful, deliberate joy. They told no one at first, guarding the news like a secret too precious to risk. Sarah began to notice small changes, the way her senses sharpened, the sudden waves of fatigue, the quiet thrum of life unfolding inside her. She kept a journal, jotting down each day's sensations as if mapping the first chapter of a story she had waited half a lifetime to tell. One afternoon, at their first ultrasound, the doctor smiled in a way Sarah had never seen before. "Well," she said, turning the screen toward them, "it looks like you're going to have quite a full house." There in the grainy black-and-white image were 5 tiny flickers of light. Sarah gripped David's hand so tightly he winced, but neither of them spoke. They stared at the screen, at those improbable sparks of life, and felt the ground shift beneath them. 5. After years of emptiness, life had returned not in a trickle, but in a sudden, impossible flood. And so the long winter that had defined their lives seemed at last to be giving way. The snow would still fall, the nights would still be long, but somewhere beneath it all, the seeds they had planted so many times before were stirring. For the first time, spring felt inevitable. From the moment Sarah and David left the clinic that day, the world seemed altered, not in a way that anyone else could see, but in the quiet, unshakable way a river changes course beneath the ice. They drove home through streets still lined with snowbanks, the trees stark against a pale sky. David's hands rested loosely on the steering wheel, but Sarah could see the way his knuckles whitened when he thought about it too hard. Every now and then he glanced at her as if to make sure she was still there, as if to confirm that the impossible was really sitting in the seat beside him. 5. The number echoed in Sarah's mind like a bell. She had whispered it to herself that morning, tasting its strangeness. 5 lives, 5 heartbeats, 5 futures tangled with her own. Sure. They told no one for the first few weeks, not out of superstition, but out of a fierce need to keep the news safe like a flame cupped against the wind. Sarah began moving through the house differently, as if the rooms themselves were fragile. She took each stair more slowly, avoided lifting the laundry basket, lingered longer in the morning sun at the kitchen table. David fussed over her in quiet ways, adjusting the pillows on the couch, keeping her tea warm, making her laugh when her mind began to spiral into worry. The changes came quickly. Her appetite grew in ways she hadn't expected. Food seemed brighter, more alive. Yet fatigue settled into her bones, a gentle but insistent weight that pulled her toward the bed in the afternoons. At night, she lay awake, feeling the rhythm of her own pulse, wondering if she could already feel theirs. Chad. The day they decided to share the news, they invited only a small circle family and two of their closest friends for what they told them was a simple winter supper. The table was set with care candles in mason jars, bowls of thick stew steaming in the center, fresh bread cooling on the counter. Snow tapped softly against the windows as they ate. Sarah waited until the plates were nearly empty before she reached for David's hand under the table. She didn't need to speak. He understood. With a calm that belied the thundering in his chest, he told them Sarah's pregnant. Smiles and laughter bloomed around the table. And then, after letting that sink in, Sarah added, "with 5. For a heartbeat, silence the kind that comes when people are trying to decide if you're joking. Then, an eruption, questions, exclamations, the sound of chairs scraping back as her mother rushed to wrap her in an embrace. Her sister wept openly, pressing her hand to Sarah's still flat belly. Even the candles seemed to burn brighter. News travels fast in a small town. Within days, Mrs. Callahan at the bakery was slipping extra loaves into their bag, murmuring about keeping your strength up. At the post office, Mr. Henson joked about building an addition to their house before spring. Neighbors left casseroles on their porch without knocking, tucked blankets and baby clothes into brown paper bags on the steps. Sarah was touched by the generosity, but also wary. She knew how quickly joy could turn. She had lived too long in the shadow of almosts and not quites. And yet there was something about the way the town gathered around them that made her believe this time could be different. Chati. The nursery became their shared project, though nursery seemed an inadequate word for what was essentially a small dormitory for infants. The room that had once been David's music studio was emptied. The piano moved to the living room. They painted the walls a soft cream the color of the morning sky before sunrise. David assembled cribs with the steady patience of a craftsman, lining them up along the wall like tiny boats waiting to launch. Boxes arrived in the mail, diapers in sizes they couldn't yet imagine. Miniature socks no bigger than thumbprints, a set of mobiles that spun tiny stars and moons. Sarah folded and refolded the clothes not because they needed it, but because the feel of the fabric grounded her in the reality of what was coming. As winter edged toward spring, Sarah's body began to bear the visible weight of her miracle. Her belly rounded quickly, the change more dramatic with each passing week. Strangers in the grocery store smiled at her, some brave enough to ask when she was due. She kept her answers light, avoiding the full truth with those she didn't know. 5 seemed too precious, too vulnerable to share with anyone who might not understand. But beneath the surface of joy, small shadows began to gather. It started with a sharp pain under her ribs one evening as she bent to pick up a dropped spoon. She brushed it off as a muscle strain, but the next day it returned, accompanied by a low ache that spread across her side. At her next appointment, she mentioned it casually to Dr. Emily Carter, who frowned and ordered some tests just to be safe. Dead. The results came back with no immediate alarm, and Sarah let herself breathe again. Still, Dr. Carter advised her to rest more, to listen to her body's warnings. "You're carrying more than most women ever will at once," she reminded her gently. "Your body is working harder than you can feel right now." Sarah took the advice to heart. Afternoons found her stretched out on the couch, a book in her lap she rarely managed to finish. David would come home from teaching, kiss her forehead, and take over whatever small chore she had left undone. In the evenings, they sat together in the quiet, listening to the wind against the house, imagining what it would sound like with the cries and laughter of 5 children. By late March, the snow had melted into small, stubborn patches, and the maples began to drip sap into metal buckets along the roadside. Sarah could feel the life inside her shifting, growing a subtle flutter one week, a definite kick the next. She began speaking to them in the mornings, her voice low and steady, telling them about the town they would grow up in, the river. They would swim in the woods where the leaves turned gold each fall. One evening, as the sun slid low over the hills, she sat on the porch with David wrapped in a blanket against the chill. "Do you ever think about how different everything will be?" she asked. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Every day," he said, "and I can't wait." Yet, even as they dreamed, Sarah began to notice her energy fading more quickly. Tasks that had once been simple left her breathless. Her ankles swelled in the evenings, her hands tingled when she lay down at night. She told herself it was just the weight of 5 new lives pressing against her from within, but deep down, a sliver of unease took root. Dr. Carter remained watchful, her eyes narrowing slightly at each appointment, though her words stayed calm. "You're doing well," she said, but always followed with, "Let's just keep a close eye on things." On the last day of March, the town held its annual Maple Festival. Sarah and David walked slowly between the stalls, greeting neighbors sipping hot cider. Children darted past with sticky fingers, the air rich with the scent of pancakes and wood smoke. For a few hours, Sarah let herself be simply a woman in love, expecting a family surrounded by the warmth of community. As dusk fell and the first stars appeared, she felt the babies shift in unison, a slow, rolling wave beneath her skin. She pressed David's hand to her belly, and for a moment the two of them stood still in the middle of the crowd, sharing a private wonder no one else could touch. It was a night Sarah would return to in her mind, many times the last one before the shadows lengthened, before the road ahead turned steeper. It was a Tuesday morning in early April when the phone rang, its sound breaking the still hush of the kitchen. Outside, frost clung stubbornly to the edges of the lawn, unwilling to surrender to spring. Sarah had been slicing apples, the small knife moving in rhythmic, absent-minded arcs, when she saw the clinic's number on the screen. She hesitated. The tests Dr. Carter had ordered a week earlier were supposed to be routine, a precaution. She'd convinced herself there was nothing to worry about. But the moment she heard the doctor's voice low, careful, carrying the weight of words not yet spoken, she knew. "Sarah," Dr. Carter said softly, "I think you should come in today. Bring David with you." The drive to the clinic felt longer than usual. The world outside the car window carried on in its quiet ordinariness, a man walking his dog, a child in a bright yellow raincoat splashing through a puddle, the steady drip of snowmelt from the eaves of houses. But inside the car the air was thick, dense, with the pressure of what might be waiting. David kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting lightly on Sarah's knee. His thumb moved in slow circles, a silent rhythm meant to reassure her, though she could feel the tension in his touch. Neither of them spoke. Dr. Carter's office was warm, the scent of coffee lingering faintly in the air. She closed the door behind them and motioned for them to sit. There was no delay, no small talk, only the truth laid carefully on the table between them. "The blood work and scans we did last week." She paused, her eyes steady on Sarah's. "They show signs of advanced hepatocellular carcinoma. It's an aggressive form of liver cancer." The words fell like stones into the still water of Sarah's mind. For a moment there was no reaction, no thought, only the sensation of falling inward. She felt David's hand grip hers hard, anchoring her to the chair. Dr. Carter went on, her voice measured. "The pregnancy complicates things significantly. With 5 babies, your body is under extraordinary strain. Standard treatment surgery chemotherapy isn't safe for them. And without treatment," she hesitated, as if searching for a gentler way to say it, "the prognosis is poor." Sarah heard the phrases, "prognosis is poor, extraordinary strain without treatment." They hung in the air like frost that refused to melt. She looked down at her hands, at the faint swelling of her knuckles, the pale half-moons of her nails. These were the hands that had dreamed of holding a child for 6 long years. Now they trembled. David was the first to speak. "What are our options?" His voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. Dr. Carter met his gaze. "From a purely medical standpoint, the safest path for Sarah is to end the pregnancy. Now begin treatment immediately. That gives her the best chance of survival. Continuing with all 5. She exhaled. "It's risky, David. Very risky." Jeez. The room seemed smaller, then the air heavier. Sarah could feel the weight of both their eyes on her David's full of fear and love, Dr. Carter's full of professional caution and reluctant hope. She closed her eyes for a moment and saw the 5 flickers of light from the ultrasound, small and determined, pulsing in the dark. When she opened them again, she spoke with a clarity that surprised even herself. "I'm not ending this pregnancy." David turned toward her sharply. "Sarah." But she shook her head, cutting him off with a quiet firmness. "I've waited too long for them. I can't." Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "If my time is shorter than I thought, I want it to be spent bringing them here to Kenneth." Dr. Carter didn't argue right away. She simply nodded, as if acknowledging the gravity of what had just been decided. "Then we'll adjust our care plan," she said finally. "It will mean frequent monitoring. We'll need to manage your symptoms as best we can and prepare for an early delivery if your health declines." David's silence was a storm she could feel without looking at him. On the drive home, the only sounds were the hum of the tires and the distant rush of wind. She knew what he was thinking, that he might lose her, that he might be left with 5 children and no partner to raise them. But she also knew that if she gave in now, a part of her would already be gone. That night, Sarah sat at the kitchen table long after David had gone to bed. The house was quiet, the kind of deep quiet that feels almost sacred. She rested her hands on her belly, feeling its gentle curve beneath the thin cotton of her nightgown. Somewhere inside, 5 hearts were beating steady and unknowing. She thought about the years they had spent chasing this dream. The tears, the hospital corridors, the sleepless nights wondering if something was wrong with her, if she was simply not meant to be a mother. And now, here they were all at once fragile and miraculous. She could not, would not choose herself over them. In the days that followed, her world narrowed to essentials. Appointments, rest. Small meals she could keep down. David hovered close, his worry manifesting in quiet acts, refilling her water glass, folding laundry before she noticed adjusting the blankets when she dozed off in the afternoon. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, a mix of awe, fear, and something like grief. The town began to sense that all was not entirely well, though they didn't know the details. Offers of help increased. Neighbors came by to shovel the walkway to drop off soup to sit with her while David ran errands. In a place as small as Maple Hollow, care was a language everyone spoke. One evening, a late snow began to fall. Fat flakes drifting lazily past the window. Sarah sat curled on the couch, her feet propped on a cushion, watching the world soften under the white. David sat beside her, his arm along the back of the couch, his fingers occasionally brushing her hair. "I'm scared," he said finally, his voice low. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for his hand and placed it on her belly. After a moment, one of the babies shifted beneath his palm. "They're scared, too," she said softly, "but we'll get through it, together." It wasn't a promise she could make with certainty, but it was the truth she needed to believe. Mom. By the end of April, her symptoms had begun to intensify. The ache in her side was constant now, a dull throb that sometimes sharpened without warning. Fatigue settled over her like a heavy quilt. Dr. Carter adjusted her appointments to weekly visits, each one a careful balancing act between hope and realism. And yet, amid the strain, there were moments of startling joy, the first time she felt all 5 move at once, a strange, synchronized wave as if they were stretching in unison. The way David's face lit up when he heard their heartbeats through the monitor. The quiet nights when she imagined their future 5 small figures running through the fields behind their house. Those moments became her anchors. As spring finally began to tip into summer, the maples unfurled their leaves. The air warmed, and Sarah's belly became a visible proclamation of defiance. Against the odds, against the logic of medicine, she was still carrying them, still holding on. She knew the road ahead would be steep, but she also knew that some battles are fought not because you're sure you'll win, but because you cannot bear to surrender. And these 5 lives, was a battle she would fight with everything she had. By the time June folded itself into July, Sarah had learned to move slowly, as if every step were a negotiation between her body and the weight it carried. Vermont's brief summer unfurled outside fields bright with wildflowers, the river glinting in the sun, but her days were measured in small, careful increments. The heat pressed against her skin like a constant reminder of the work her body was doing. Even simple tasks like reaching for a glass or shifting in bed left her breathless. Yet the curve of her belly, impossibly round and full, was also a source of quiet pride. It told the story of defiance, of 5 lives still thriving inside her, despite every warning. Dr. Emily Carter had become more than a physician. She was a sentinel. Weekly appointments turned into bi-weekly visits as Sarah's condition grew more fragile. Each checkup was thorough blood tests, ultrasounds, blood pressure readings that sometimes made Emily's brow crease. But Sarah trusted her. There was something in Emily's steady hands and measured voice that anchored her through the long days. "You're doing well," Emily would say, though Sarah could hear the unspoken for now in the pauses between words. David was never far from her side. He adjusted his teaching schedule to be home most afternoons, filling the house with the soft hum of piano music. Sometimes he would sit at the end of the couch while she rested, his fingers drifting across the keys in the next room, creating a score for their quiet, suspended life. The community's care became a lifeline. Neighbors dropped by with fresh bread still warm from the oven jars of homemade jam bags of ripe tomatoes from backyard gardens. Mrs. Callahan appeared once a week with casseroles, insisting she'd made too much by accident. Even those who barely knew them seemed drawn into the orbit of their story, offering to mow the lawn, to fetch groceries, to simply sit and keep her company. Sarah accepted these gestures with gratitude, though sometimes the attention made her uneasy. The town's faith in her survival felt heavier than the babies themselves. She wanted to believe in it too, but in the quiet moments when no one else could see, she knew the line between hope and reality was razor thin. July slipped into August, and with it came a subtle shift. The air, once heavy with summer's warmth, began to carry hints of the crisp autumn to come. Sarah's symptoms grew more pronounced. The ache in her side had sharpened into a constant throb. Her skin stretched tight over the swell of her abdomen. Swelling in her ankles made walking a slow, deliberate act. Nights were the hardest. Lying down pressed the weight of 5 growing lives into her lungs, making each breath shallow. David became skilled in small comforts, the placement of pillows to ease her hips, the gentle massage of her swollen feet, the way he'd read aloud from her favorite books until her breathing slowed. His hands, once accustomed to coaxing melodies from ivory keys, now learned the language of care. Emily visited the house more often now, carrying her stethoscope and portable equipment in a worn leather bag. She examined Sarah in the living room sunlight pooling on the floor, the distant sound of cicadas filling the pauses. After each visit, she'd speak quietly with David in the kitchen. Sarah could catch fragments, liver function monitor, closely prepare, early delivery, but she didn't press. Some truths she thought could be carried by others for a little while. One late afternoon, Emily lingered after an appointment. She sat beside Sarah, both of them watching the slow movement of clouds beyond the window. "You know," Emily said, her voice almost casual, "when I was your age, I was pregnant too. A little boy." She paused, and the stillness between them deepened. "I lost him at 24 weeks, and for a long time I thought my life had ended there." She looked at Sarah, her eyes steady. "You remind me of what it means to keep going." Sarah didn't speak, but she reached for Emily's hand, holding it in a silence that felt heavier than words. Sure. The nursery had taken on a life of its own. The 5 cribs stood side by side, each with its own small blanket folded at the end. Sarah spent afternoons there sitting in the old rocking chair her grandmother had given her, letting her mind wander through imagined scenes. Midnight feedings, the smell of freshly washed baby hair, the sound of laughter spilling into the hallway. These visions were like postcards from a future she wasn't certain she'd see, but she collected them all the same. Sometimes in the quiet of that room she would press her palm to her belly and feel the shifting inside the rolling wave of limbs and tiny kicks. She whispered to them about the world outside, about their father's music, about how each one had been wanted before they even existed. By September, the trees at the edge of Maple Hollow had begun to burn with color. The maples flamed red and orange, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke, and evenings arrived earlier. With the beauty came an undeniable truth. Sarah was nearing the edge of what her body could bear. At her latest appointment, Emily studied the ultrasound with narrowed eyes. All 5 babies were growing well, but Sarah's liver function numbers were dropping. "We may need to consider an early delivery," Emily said, her voice gentle but firm. "Your body is working so hard, Sarah. We don't want to push it past the point of no return." Sarah nodded, though her chest tightened. Early delivery meant risk, but then so did every day they waited. The days became a delicate balance. Sarah spent more time in bed, her world shrinking to the soft cocoon of blankets and the steady presence of David nearby. Friends visited in short bursts, bringing bits of the outside world with them, news from the town, the changing colors of the hills, the scent of fresh apple pie still warm in its tin. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, like the hours before a storm. Everyone knew something was coming. No one knew exactly when. The winter of waiting had arrived, though outside the leaves still clung stubbornly to their branches. "Chia," said. One evening in late September, Sarah woke to the sound of rain against the roof. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. She turned her head to find David asleep in the chair beside the bed. His head tilted at an awkward angle, his hand still resting lightly on her arm. She lay there, listening to the rain, feeling the occasional ripple of movement in her belly. A thought came to her then, quiet but certain. This might be the last season I see from this side of the glass. And yet the thought did not bring fear. Instead, it brought a fierce sense of peace. She had made her choice. She would see it through. In the first days of October, Emily scheduled another checkup. This time, after listening to the heartbeats and checking Sarah's vitals, she spoke plainly. "We can't wait much longer. Your numbers are slipping and I'm concerned about your strength." She rested a hand on Sarah's arm. "I think it's time to prepare." David was silent, his eyes fixed on a point just beyond the doctor's shoulder. Sarah simply nodded. The waiting was over. The next chapter was about to begin. That night, the town slept under a sky heavy with clouds, unaware that within days the quiet hum of Maple Hollow would give way to the sound of 5 new voices and perhaps the loss of one beloved one. The morning came without ceremony, the way storms often do not in a rush, but in a quiet shift of the air that told you something was about to change. It was October 12th, a date Sarah would never remember on her own, but one that David would carry like an etching in bone. The night before had been restless. Sarah woke often, the weight inside her pressing harder than ever. The ache in her side a dull and constant drumbeat. Just before dawn, she found herself staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creak of the old house in the wind. Somewhere beneath her hand, a ripple of movement passed across her belly. She whispered a silent promise soon to the 5 tiny lives within her. By 7 a.m., the decision had been made. Dr. Emily Carter arrived at the house with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind for weeks. Sarah's latest readings were troubling. Her pulse quickened too easily, her breath shallowed without effort. It was time. The drive to the hospital was short, but the world outside seemed altered, as if the trees, the streets, even the pale sky knew the gravity of what was about to unfold. David's hand stayed on hers the entire ride, their fingers interlocked with a grip neither wanted to loosen. In the surgical wing, the air was cool, humming faintly with the rhythm of machines. The preparation was efficient, monitors attached an IV, threaded into the crook of her arm, the bright lights overhead washing the color from her skin. Sarah lay still, watching the blur of movement around her, the faces partially hidden behind masks. The smell of antiseptic clung to the air. Emily leaned over, her voice steady. "We'll take good care of you, Sarah." There was no pretense in her eyes, only the truth of someone who knew exactly how fine the line between life and death could be to her. The procedure began with the measured urgency of a team that understood they were not delivering one life but 5. The first cry came quickly, high, sharp, insistent, filling the room with a sound that made David's chest tighten. The nurses moved swiftly, tending to the newborn before passing the tiny, swaddled bundle to the warmer. Moments later, another cry and another. Each one seemed to pull a piece of Sarah's strength with it, her breathing growing more labored as the minutes passed. By the time the 5th baby entered the world, the room had shifted. There was celebration in the voices, 5 lives safe, breathing here, but beneath it ran a current of tension. Sarah's vitals were slipping. "Kid." David, standing near the head of the bed, saw the way Emily's expression changed. It was subtle, a tightening of the jaw, a quick glance toward the anesthesiologist. "She's losing too much blood," someone said quietly. The words seemed to echo, muffled, yet heavy. He reached for her hand, feeling the coolness of her skin. "Sarah, stay with me," he murmured, his voice cracking in a way he would remember later, with shame and love intertwined. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused but searching, and he thought he saw the ghost of a smile. Then her eyelids lowered, her hand slackening in his. The next moments blurred the rush of movement, the beeping of alarms, the low, urgent voices speaking in medical shorthand. David stood frozen, his back against the wall, watching strangers fight for the woman who was his entire world. It felt like being underwater. Sound and light distorted the air, too thick to breathe. At last, Emily approached her mask, pulled down, her voice measured but somber. "She's stable, but she's in a deep coma. We'll move her to intensive care." The words landed like stones, heavy and immovable. Coma, the space between life and death. In the NICU, 5 tiny lives lay under soft lights, their chests rising and falling in fragile rhythm. David stood among them, his hands resting on the clear edges of the bassinets. They were perfect, impossibly small, but perfect, and yet his gaze kept drifting toward the door, toward the thought of Sarah lying in another room, silent and still. When the nurses encouraged him to hold them, he hesitated, afraid that joy might feel like betrayal while Sarah could not share it. But eventually, he lifted the smallest, pressing the warm weight against his chest. The baby's heartbeat, rapid and sure, seemed to pulse into him like a message. "She's still ours. She's still here." That night, David sat beside Sarah's bed in the ICU. The room was dim, the only sounds the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator and the steady beeping of monitors. Her face was pale, framed by tubes and wires, yet there was a softness there, as if she were simply sleeping. He spoke to her in low tones, telling her about each of the babies, their hair, their tiny hands, the way one had curled instinctively into a fist as if ready for the world. He told her their names, chosen together months ago, letting each one hang in the air like a prayer. When words failed, he simply held her hand, willing his warmth into her skin. In the days that followed, the hospital staff moved like quiet guardians, tending to both the new lives in the NICU and the fragile life in the ICU. Emily visited often, dividing her time between monitoring the baby's progress and checking Sarah's unchanging condition. "It's too early to know," she told David. "Comas can last days, weeks, sometimes longer." David nodded, though inside him something rebelled against the idea of waiting passively. He remembered reading once that the body could respond to familiar voices, to touch, to love. That night, as he sat beside her again, he made a decision. If Sarah could not come to them, then he would bring their children to her. 10. On the 4th day after the birth, David entered the ICU with the smallest of the babies swaddled in his arms. The nurse hesitated, but didn't stop him. Perhaps she saw something in his expression that needed no permission. He placed the baby gently against Sarah's chest, arranging the blankets so that skin touched skin. The baby stirred, letting out a small sigh, its tiny hand resting against her collarbone. David leaned close, his voice a whisper meant for both of them. "They're waiting for you," he thought, or perhaps only imagined that her fingers moved the faintest twitch against the sheet. From that day on, it became a ritual. Each day, one by one, he brought the babies to her, letting their warmth and the rhythm of their heartbeats seep into the quiet where she floated. He told her about their feedings, about the way the nurses laughed when 2 of them managed to cry in perfect unison about the sunlight in the NICU at dawn. The hospital became a place of contrasts. In one wing, the fragile cries of newborns. In another, the steadfast hum of machines keeping someone alive. And between them, David moved like a bridge, carrying love from one side to the other. On the evening of the 7th day, as he sat with her hand in his, David realized he no longer feared the silence. It had become part of their language, a space where love did not need words. Still, each time he looked at her face, he whispered the same sentence before he left. "Come back to us." He didn't know if she could hear him, but he knew he would keep saying it until she did. In the quiet corridors of the hospital, time moved differently. Days didn't follow the sun or the clock on the wall. They followed the rhythm of monitors, the cycles of feeding in the NICU, the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes against linoleum floors. For David, every morning began the same way. He would rise from the narrow cot in the family lounge, stretch the stiffness from his limbs, and make the short walk to the intensive care unit. The door to Sarah's room opened with a muted click, revealing the same scene, her still form against white sheets. The faint hum of the ventilator, the steady blip of her heart on the monitor. He never got used to it. In those early days, the doctors called it stabilized condition, but David thought of it as a kind of holding pattern. Sarah suspended between 2 worlds, tethered only by the threads that love and memory could provide. He refused to believe she was unaware. Somewhere beneath the layers of silence, he imagined she was listening. It was on the 4th day after her surgery that he began the ritual in earnest. He had carried the smallest of their children to her, placed the baby on her chest, and seen, or thought he had seen, the faintest movement in her fingers. That moment became his compass. Each morning after, he would bring one of the babies from the NICU, swaddled in soft blankets, their warmth radiating like a tiny sun. He would adjust Sarah's gown to expose her skin, lay the baby gently against her, and watch as the rise and fall of their small chests matched the rhythm of her own. Sometimes he would hum softly an old lullaby his mother used to sing. Other times he would simply sit in silence, letting the air between them carry what words could not. The nurses noticed. Some smiled discreetly, some turned away with tears in their eyes. Even the most pragmatic among them admitted there was something different about the room when David was there, a quiet charge, as if the space itself leaned toward hope. The babies, though fragile, seemed to sense it too. They settled quickly against her, their tiny hands curling instinctively into the fabric of her gown, their breathing steadying as if they recognized the heartbeat beneath. David liked to imagine that the same blood, the same shared months of life made this contact more than physical, that it was a call across whatever distance Sarah was trapped in. He spoke to her constantly. About the babies' weights, their feeding schedules, the funny way one of them wrinkled her nose when she yawned. About the leaves changing outside, the scent of autumn in the air, the sound of rain on the hospital roof. He told her stories from before their first trip to the coast, the night they'd danced in the kitchen to a song on the radio, the time they'd painted the nursery before there was any reason to. On the 12th day, he noticed something new. As he laid their second-born against her, her breathing seemed to hitch, not in distress, but in a way that made him pause. He leaned closer, watching her face. Her eyelids didn't open, but there was the faintest crease in her brow as if she were listening more intently. "Sarah," he whispered. "They're here. All 5, and they need you." The crease smoothed again, but the image stayed with him, a spark in the dark. Duh. Dr. Emily Carter continued her visits, dividing her time between the NICU and Sarah's room. She didn't offer false promises, but she didn't discourage David either. "The brain is a strange and resilient thing," she said once. "Sometimes what brings someone back isn't medicine, it's meaning." Those words burrowed into David's heart. If meaning was what she needed, he would give her all of it: the warmth of their children, the sound of his voice, the stories of a life waiting just beyond the veil. Boy. The days blurred into weeks. Maple Hollow's October flamed red and gold outside the hospital windows, the first frost touching the edges of the lawn. Inside, David's world was distilled to 2 places: the NICU, where 5 tiny lives fought their own battles, and the ICU, where Sarah fought hers. His body began to feel the strain, the constant walking between units, the short nights of sleep, the emotional weight of guarding 2 fragile fronts. Yet he refused to step back. The babies were thriving slowly, each gaining ounces, each showing more alertness. And Sarah was changing in ways only he seemed to notice. Doomed. On the 19th day, he felt it clearly. Their 4th-born, the one with the quietest cry, had been resting against her for nearly an hour. David was reading aloud from a worn book of poetry when he felt the lightest pressure against his hand. Sarah's fingers curling barely perceptible. He froze, afraid that moving would break the spell. "Sarah, if you can hear me squeeze again." There was no second squeeze, but her hand didn't relax entirely. It stayed there against his as if marking the first step back. From then on, he became even more deliberate. He played her favorite pieces on a small portable keyboard he brought from home, the notes filling the room in place of the sterile beeps. He brought in the scent of the seasons, a small jar of cinnamon from their kitchen, a sprig of dried lavender from the porch. Anything to remind her of the world beyond this room. He even allowed himself moments of hope strong enough to imagine what he would say when she woke, how the babies looked now, how the town had rallied, how her fight had been seen by more hearts than she knew. By early November, winter's first snow arrived, swirling past the tall hospital windows in slow, deliberate flakes. David stood at her bedside, one of the twins nestled against her, and felt a shift he couldn't explain. Her breathing, though still aided by machines, seemed to fall into rhythm with the baby's. Her lips parted slightly, a sigh escaping faint, but hers. He leaned close, his forehead resting against hers. "We're right here. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are they." He stayed like that for a long time, listening to the twin heartbeats, waiting for the day when hers would quicken with life again. That night before leaving, he whispered his usual words, "Come back to us," and this time, for the first time, he thought he saw her eyelids tremble. It was enough to carry him through another day. It happened on the kind of morning that seemed designed for quiet miracles. Snow had begun falling before dawn, the kind that drifted slow and deliberate, each flake distinct before it joined the whiteness below. The hospital corridors were hushed, muffled by the storm outside, and in room 214, the steady rhythms of machines kept their patient vigil. David arrived early, cradling their 3rd-born in his arms. He had learned the art of moving silently, of slipping into the room without disturbing the delicate balance that lived there. The baby stirred warm against his chest as he crossed to Sarah's bedside. Her skin felt less cool that morning, or perhaps it was wishful thinking. Either way, he eased the blankets aside, opening her gown just enough to lay the baby against her. The tiny body curled instinctively, cheek-to-skin fingers spreading as if searching for something familiar. David began to speak, his voice low, more breath than sound. He told her about the snow, about how the town would look now, the red roofs capped in white, the riverbanks softened, the pines bowed under their new weight. He described the smell of cinnamon in the NICU from a nurse's holiday cookies, the way one of the twins had learned to grip his thumb and refused to let go, and then, without thinking, he began to hum. It was the same tune he'd played for her on the night they'd painted the nursery a melody that had wound itself through their marriage like a second heartbeat. The baby shifted, letting out a small sigh. That was when he saw it. Joy. At first, it was only a tremor in her eyelids, a flicker so quick he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching. Then her fingers moved, curling slightly against the sheet. Sarah. His voice broke the name, catching on the edge of disbelief. Her eyelids trembled again, then, slowly, heavily, they began to lift. The light from the window caught in her eyes as they opened, unfocused, but searching. David leaned closer, filling her vision with his face, his breath catching on the edge of a sob. "You're here," he whispered. It took time for awareness to return like the slow thaw of ice under spring sun. Her gaze wandered unsteady until it caught on the small form resting against her. The baby stirred a tiny fist pressing against her collarbone. Her lips parted, and a sound came, not a word, but a soft exhale that carried more meaning than language. Tears blurred David's vision as he watched her turn her head just slightly to press her cheek against their child. It was not the dramatic awakening the movies promised. It was better a fragile quiet crossing back into the world guided by touch and breath and love. The nurses moved quickly but without alarm, checking her vitals, adjusting the bed. Dr. Emily Carter appeared, her expression shifting from professional focus to something gentler, warmer. "Welcome back," she said softly. And though Sarah's voice was still beyond reach, her eyes answered. David remained at her side through it all, one hand on her arm, the other cradling the baby. He told her everything in short, steady sentences, that the babies were healthy, that she had been asleep for weeks, that he had brought them to her every day. When he told her she had never once been alone, her eyes filled, and a single tear traced down her cheek. Ted. The reunion with all five came later that day. One by one, the nurses brought them in swaddled and drowsy, placing them gently in the crook of her arms or against her chest. The room filled with the soft sounds of their breathing, the occasional squeak or sigh. Sarah's hands moved slowly, reverently, touching each tiny face, as if memorizing them by feel. David sat beside her, watching her take in the sight of what they had made together, the improbable truth of 5 perfect lives. "This," he murmured, "is the sound of our family." Her lips curved the faintest smile, but one that reached her eyes. Gee. Recovery was not immediate, nor was it easy. Sarah's body bore the cost of the months before weakness in her muscles, the lingering ache in her side, the careful balance of medications. But each day she grew stronger, and each day she asked for her children. In the weeks that followed, the ICU room transformed. The scent of baby lotion mingled with the sterile air, tiny hats and blankets draped over chairs, lullabies replacing the constant hum of machines. Visitors from Maple Hollow came with casseroles, knitted sweaters, stories from the town. One snowy afternoon, Mrs. Callahan arrived with a gift, 5 hand-knit stockings each with a different colored ribbon. For their first Christmas, she said, and Sarah's smile that day was wider than the pain could contain. By early December, the doctors began speaking of discharge, first for the babies, then for Sarah. The idea of leaving the hospital, of returning to the white clapboard house on Willow Lane, filled David with both relief and fear. But when he asked Sarah how she felt, her answer was simple: ready. They left on a morning much like the one she'd woken to snow drifting in the air, the world softened by winter. The car ride home was quiet, the babies bundled in their carriers, and the two of them exchanging small, wordless glances that spoke of everything they'd survived. At home, the nursery waited 5 cribs lined up like tiny harbors. Sarah walked slowly to the rocking chair, lowered herself into it, and held the smallest of their children against her. The sound of the wind outside was gentle, almost like breathing. Ted. That night, after the babies were asleep, David brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her in the dim light of the nursery. Do you remember the first thing you said to me when we started this journey? He asked. She thought for a moment, then shook her head. You said, he continued, if we're lucky, we'll get a lifetime. He paused, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I think we just learned that a lifetime is made of moments like this. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes drifting to the cribs. In the soft hush of the room, she whispered, Then let's make them count. 10. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the town in white. In the small house at the end of Willow Lane, 6 heartbeats, 5 rapid. 1 steady filled the air with a rhythm that spoke of survival, of love, of the quiet kind of courage that chooses to stay. If you believe in stories of love, resilience, and miracles, remember to subscribe to our channel for more journeys that will touch your heart.